Hi, everyone. I'm Jill Harkavy-Friedman, the Vice President of Research at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, also known as AFSP. And I'm here with Dave King. And Dave, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Dave King, and I'm the Group President for Dynetics, a Leidos wholly owned subsidiary. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation about suicide prevention as we wrap up National Suicide Prevention Month. So Jill, I'd like for you to start off, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off by sharing why you've dedicated your career to suicide prevention and give us a brief overview about what AFSP is all about.
So I started my career in suicide prevention as a young PhD in 1985, when I would say there wasn't really a field. And in 1992, I got my first research grant from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And, you know, suicide prevention is about saving lives. And the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has as our mission to save lives and bring hope to those affected by suicide. And we do that through research, education, advocacy, and support for those who are affected by suicide. And so we have a national office and we have 72 chapters around the country where we host programs, where we have community walks, which we'll be talking some more about, and where we have a grassroots effort to reduce the rate of suicide. And while we may not be able to prevent every suicide, we're doing our best to learn what we can do to save lives and bring hope. Dave, why don't you tell us a little bit about what led you to become the executive champion for the Leidos AFSP partnership?
Yeah, so first of all, I was involved in a couple of efforts for suicide prevention prior to joining Leidos back in January of 2020. I'm on a board of a nonprofit that puts mental health counselors in the schools in our region, first of all. And then I'm also the chairman of the board of Huntsville Hospital Foundation, which is a regional hospital system, which has a program named Speak that's all about bringing forth awareness and knowledge on this very topic. So suicide is the second or third leading cause of death in kids ages 10 to 24. And depending on the specific age group. And I find that is an issue that needed addressed, and that's why I chose to be involved from the beginning. So I think it's important for our employees and their families, and I felt compelled to try to help. And then when I joined Leidos in 2020, I soon learned that back in 2017, Leidos made a commitment to mental health and suicide prevention. At that time, it was related to opioid addiction, and since that has been broadened. And at that time, they kicked off a mission for the Mind campaign, and one of the three key pillars of that campaign was suicide prevention. So I've personally been touched by it both in my personal life and in my career, as most people have. And I also think that this pandemic has impacted so many aspects of our lives, and it's taken a toll on the mental health of many, leading to an increased risk of suicide. So it's always important, but now it feels even more urgent. And I wanted to do whatever I could to help elevate this issue and deal with it. So Jill, could you share with us some of the trends that have been going on recently in your research?
Yeah, so one of the things that you mentioned is that the pandemic has had a huge effect. And we've learned that it's had a huge effect on attitudes about suicide prevention, just as you mentioned, which is that people feel now more than ever that preventing suicide is a national imperative. We've also learned that 94% of people say that they think suicide can be prevented, at least sometimes. That's up from just a few years ago, where most people didn't realize that we could do something to prevent suicide. Now, from a research standpoint and the grants that we fund, this year we're funding $6.4 million in new research grants. It's been a process of learning. So it's going to sound funny, but we've learned how important the brain is in suicide prevention. And that sounds funny because what we don't realize is that as recently as 1974, the idea that brain function was a part of suicide prevention was not known and discussed. And it was thought, oh, we'll study how the brain is affected when somebody tries to kill themselves. But now we've learned that certain parts of the brain are not functioning optimally, and that there are certain genetic trends that contribute to that. But the good news is we've learned that what that leads to is this kind of cognitive inflexibility, meaning that people don't have access to their usual coping abilities. And so now we have treatments and interventions that help people to have access and to outline coping strategies for when a suicidal crisis happens, so they don't have to think of strategies in a crisis moment. So all that came from understanding that the brain is related to suicide, that people who have made suicide attempts or died by suicide think differently, but that we can change that thinking to help people make it through suicide crises. And then finally, we've shown that, so one of our researchers showed that the brain actually changes with these interventions. And this is really important because there is a genetic component to suicide, but it's really important to know that it's changeable, that just because you're at risk doesn't mean that you're destined to die by suicide. Now, that's just a little bit of what we've learned from the research.
That's fascinating. And boy, the human brain and the way it works is so complex. And
yeah.
I think it's fascinating to hear of this research. Are there any early warning signs or educational programs to help individuals make a difference? So much of this is about awareness and knowledge and our ability and desire to do something about it. So help us with that for a moment.
Yeah, so you're right. And one of the things, for instance, that our WALK program does, which is not an education program, is it brings people into the realm of awareness. And the reason why awareness is so important is you can't do something if you don't know it exists. And so our programs help to teach people about the risk factors and warning signs and what to do. So what does that actually mean? We're trying to help people have real conversations with each other to destigmatize mental health and suicide, so that people realize that so many are affected by suicide. So hindsight is 2020. We're trying to bring that to the present. So what are some of the risk factors and warning signs? We'll talk warning signs. These warning signs that I'm going to list don't necessarily happen 5 minutes before a suicide crisis. They might happen a month before. You might see some of this a year before. And so as I go through the list, what we're trying to do is help people to think about reaching out to someone if you see this at any point. They don't have to be in a crisis. So what people say, what they do, and how they feel all provide warning signs that someone may be at risk for suicide. So they may say things like, well, it won't matter next year at this time, or I'm a burden to you and you'll be better off if I'm gone, or nobody cares about me and it really doesn't matter what I do. They may talk about feeling hopeless and that there's nothing they can do to get out of their current problems. And that's the suicidal brain saying, I'm stuck. They may do things that they wouldn't normally do. So they may do things like sleeping more or sleeping less, although insomnia in and of itself is a really important warning sign. They may be acting recklessly, because that's what reckless behavior means. It means you don't care what happens to you. They may be going on the internet and doing searches for ways to kill yourself. They may actually be going to friends and family and giving things away, saying, this is really important to me, I want you to have it, kind of out of the blue. It doesn't mean that any one of these things in and of itself means someone's at risk, but if you have a gut feeling, reach out, just check in with the person. And then finally, there are moods that you might see. So we all think about depression as part of suicide, but also people might be agitated, they might be angry, they might be apathetic, like nothing matters. They might even be irritable and aggressive, and they'll also often start drinking more, using drugs more. They might be in pain. So these are some of the warning signs where a person, what happens is that they feel so desperate and in so much emotional pain that they feel they don't have any options. And they think about death as not about dying. They're not thinking about dying, they're thinking about stopping the pain. So if you see any of these warning signs, or you just have a gut feeling that someone is really not, faring well, that they're withdrawing, they're isolating, they're pulling back from their life, having a conversation and reaching out to them will not make them suicidal. However, it could bring tremendous relief, and then you can connect them to care. You don't have to become a therapist. You just can connect them to somebody who can help them. So I've listed off a lot of things, but you can find this information at afsp.org. And please come to that website to learn more.
Yeah, Jill, that's very helpful. Thank you. You know, so many times we have a gut feel about something and we don't do anything about it. This is a particular instance where we should not allow that to happen. We do need to follow up, and we do need to have that next conversation, and we do need to help people find the resources along the way. And if we each take that action, we can all make a difference on this very critical issue. So a lot can be accomplished if we work together as a team. So speaking of teams, Leidos has several Out of the Darkness walk teams participating across the country this fall. We started by joining the Out of the Darkness walk back in 2019 with a team in Washington. And we're continuing to grow participation over the last few years. Can you share with us any more information or impacts of those walks?
So the walks, I've been walking just because not as a researcher, not as an employee, which I've been for 10 years, but because it's important to put a face on suicide prevention. And so the walks are community walks. They're called Out of the Darkness walks. You can find out where they are by looking at chapter information on our website and putting in your zip code, and you can find out where there's a walk near you. So what the walks do is they provide support for people who've been affected by suicide, even people who may be currently having suicidal thoughts and feelings. But they also say to people, if you've engaged in suicidal behavior or lost someone to suicide, come out. There's nothing to hide. There's nothing to be embarrassed about. There's nothing to be ashamed about. And you showing up could save somebody else's life. The walks are really uplifting. I think you might have been on some. They're very upbeat, but they're also a way to acknowledge people who've been lost. And when you walk down the street and someone says to you, "Oh, you're walking to prevent suicide? I'd like to do that." Or "I lost someone." That builds a suicide prevention community. So the community walks are pretty short. They're usually 1 to 3 miles. You can man a table if you can't walk. You can host a table. I don't think. It's just a great way to gather, to share information about suicide prevention, and show that together we can fight suicide.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Friedman. Thank you for taking the time to chat with us today. And I look forward to the activities this fall as we continue to raise this awareness and the critical funds that are needed for AFSP.
Yes, thank you so much. And just so you know, this year, based on the walks and the funds we've gathered, we're funding $6.44 million new dollars in new research. So these walks make a difference for research, for education, for advocacy, and for supporting people who are affected by suicide. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.